name is Edmund Voss. I'm 63 years old. For 38 years, my job was to find the number that didn't belong. Not the obvious ones. Any junior auditor can spot those. I mean the quiet number, the one sitting 3 rows down in column G, perfectly formatted, perfectly rounded, that shouldn't exist at all. I retired from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division 4 years ago. My daughter's husband doesn't know that. He thinks I spent my career reviewing small business tax returns in a grey federal building in Columbus. I never corrected him. It was easier that way. Safer. I was late to Thanksgiving dinner at my daughter's house. I'd gone stuck behind an accident on I-71, and by the time I pulled into their subdivision, one of those new developments where every house looks like it was printed from the same file, the lights inside were already blazing, and I could hear music through the front door. I was going to knock. That was my intention. But the door was slightly open, just an inch, and I heard his voice carrying over the music before my hand touched the wood. My son-in-law was mid-toast. He was standing in the living room with a wineglass raised, and there were maybe 15 people around him, friends of theirs, people I barely recognized. Someone must have asked about me because he said real loud, real comfortable, "You know what the best part of Thanksgiving this year is?" And then he laughed the way he always laughs, that wide, stagey laugh that never quite reaches his eyes. The old man couldn't make it. More laughter. Someone said something I couldn't catch. And my son-in-law said, "Honestly, hope it stays that way." My daughter was standing 3 feet from him. She didn't say a word. She touched his arm and smiled like he'd made a mildly embarrassing joke at a work party. That small diplomatic smile that means, "You're being a little much, but I'll handle it later." She didn't handle it. She lifted her own glass. I stood in the cold for another 10 seconds. Then I pulled the door closed as quietly as I'd found it, walked back to my truck, and drove home. An hour later, their evening fell apart. They didn't know it yet. My daughter's name is June. She's 34. She used to be sharp in a way that made me proud. Not just book smart, she had instincts. She'd catch things. She majored in accounting at Ohio State, which I'll admit I encouraged, and for 2 years after graduation she worked at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, and she was good at it. Then she met my son-in-law, whose name was Troy Decker, and within 18 months she'd quit the firm, married him, and moved into a house in Dublin, Ohio that costs $180,000, and that, as far as I can tell, neither of them can actually afford. Troy sells investment opportunities. That's the phrase he uses. It shifts depending on the year. Real estate syndications, private equity funds, cryptocurrency platforms, the specifics change. The structure doesn't. He finds people with money and convinces them to give it to him to manage. I don't know how much of it is legal. I know that some of it isn't, because I've watched him for 3 years, and I know what the seams look like when someone is running a scheme. He doesn't know what I used to do. To him, I'm Edmund Voss, retired federal employee. He's never once asked me what division. When he found out I worked for the IRS, he said, "God, that sounds depressing." I told him it had its moments. He lost interest immediately. He calls me Ed. My daughter used to call me Dad. Now she mostly follows his lead. The drive home that night, I went over the past 6 weeks in my head. It had started with a phone call, my daughter, using the soft voice she only uses when she needs something. She'd called me on a Sunday morning in early October. "Dad, I just want to run something by you." When she calls me Dad in that particular tone, I know to listen carefully to every word that follows. She told me Troy had a deal, a real estate development in the Carolinas. Beach properties, pre-sales, strong projected returns. They needed capital. Not my money, she emphasized, just a guarantor. Someone to co-sign on a business line of credit. my name, my credit score, my federal pension as proof of income. "It's not like they'd ever actually come after you," she said. "It's just paperwork." I told her I needed to think about it. I thought about it. I thought about it the same way I used to think about a flagged return. Not whether something felt wrong, but where, specifically, the wrong thing was hiding. 3 days later, I drove past their house on my way back from a hardware store. I wasn't planning to stop. But there was something new in the driveway. A black GMC Yukon Denali, current year, fully loaded. I know that truck. I priced one out once and then drove home in my 217 F-150 and made my peace with it. That Yukon runs $82,000 minimum. My son-in-law had just asked me to co-sign a business line of credit because he needed a guarantor. He was driving an $82,000 truck. I didn't stop. I kept driving. But something in my chest went very still and quiet. The way it used to go quiet when I was sitting across a conference table from someone, and I'd just found the number. I got home from Thanksgiving, hung up my coat, and sat at my kitchen table. My house is a 3-bedroom ranch in Worthington that I've owned since 1991. The mortgage has been paid off since 2014. It's not impressive. The kitchen is original to 1987, and I've never cared enough to update it. My son-in-law once walked through it and said, "You know, Ed, you got good bones here. You should do something with this place." He said it the way you'd say it to someone who'd shown up to a dinner party in the wrong clothes. I made coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. I have a friend named Dennis, who spent 22 years as a forensic accountant at the FBI field office in Cincinnati, before he retired and opened a private consulting firm. We worked 2 cases together in the early 2000s, a mortgage fraud ring operating out of Dayton, and a payroll skimming operation at a chain of car washes. Dennis is the kind of man who answers his phone on federal holidays because he genuinely cannot help himself. I called him at 9:30 on Thanksgiving night. He picked up on the second ring. "Edmund, I'm watching football." "I know, I need a favor." I heard him mute the TV. That was Dennis's version of clearing his schedule. I told him what I needed, a full financial workup on Troy Allen Decker, business entities, credit profile, judgment liens, UCC filings, beneficial ownership on any LLCs or partnerships. I told him about the line of credit request. I told him about the Yukon. I did not tell him about the toast, because that wasn't relevant, and also because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Dennis said, "How fast do you need this?" "Yesterday." "It's Thanksgiving." "I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have something for you by Friday morning. And Edmund, if this is what I think it might be, you're going to want to be sitting down when you read it." I didn't sleep well that Thursday night. I'm not a man who has trouble sleeping, generally, but there's a particular kind of dread that comes when you already know what you're going to find, and you're just waiting for the confirmation. I lay in the dark and I thought about June at 22 showing me her first real work product, a clean, thorough audit of a small non-profit, and the way she'd explained every line like she was proud of it. I thought about her at 34, standing 3 feet from her husband while he made a toast about hoping her father didn't come back. I thought about my wife, Barbara, who died 6 years ago. She'd liked Troy at first. She said he had energy. She would have stopped liking him by now. Barbara had no patience for men who performed generosity while calculating the return. The email from Dennis arrived at 7:14 Friday morning. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and I read it. Then I read it again. Troy Allen Decker had 4 active LLCs registered in Ohio and 1 in Delaware. He had a judgment lien against him personally from a civil suit in Franklin County. A former investor settled for an undisclosed amount in 2021. He had 2 IRS tax liens, both filed within the last 30 months, totaling just over $119,000. His personal credit score was $511. His personal credit score was 511. He was carrying 11 separate credit accounts, most of them near or at their limits. The Yukon was leased, not purchased, and the lease was 61 days delinquent as of the previous month. He had asked my daughter to ask me to guarantee a business line of credit. Then Dennis had written a separate paragraph, the kind he flags with a single asterisk, which in his communication style means this is the part that changes everything. One of Troy's LLCs, a company called Decker Capital Partners LLC, had received 30 wire transfers over the previous 14 months. The amounts varied, but they all shared one characteristic. They were structured in increments just under $10,000. The federal threshold for automatic bank reporting is $10,000. Transactions below that threshold are still reportable if a pattern is detected, but they're harder to catch in the noise. 30 transfers varying between $7,400 and $9,800. Total received just over $260,000. Dennis had included a note at the bottom. The account this money came from traces to a shell registered in Nevada, nominee director, no real address. I have a contact at FinCEN. I think you should let me make a call. I closed the laptop. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The next thing I needed to do required going back to my study. My study is a small room off the hallway that my son-in-law once glanced into and said, "Ha, very federal employee of you," because of the filing cabinets. There are 3 of them. Gray, standard issue, the kind you can buy at an office liquidation sale for $40 each. He was not wrong that they look like they belong in a government building. That's because they came from one. The bottom drawer of the 3rd cabinet is locked. It has been locked since the day I moved here from my old office. My son-in-law tried to open it once, casually, the way people try locked things when they think no one is watching. He found it wouldn't move and lost interest in about 4 seconds. I keep the key in a small magnetic case stuck to the underside of the middle filing cabinet. It's not sophisticated. It doesn't need to be. The drawer opened smoothly. Inside, in a manila folder, my retirement credentials. My special agent badge, still in its leather case, my credentials card, my CI unit citation, the commendation letter from the Assistant United States Attorney in the Southern District of Ohio after the Moreland case. I picked up the badge. The leather was worn at the hinge. I'd carried it for 38 years. I set it on the desk next to my coffee mug. Troy Decker thought I was a tax return processor. He thought I was a man you could dismiss with a joke at a holiday party. He thought the quietest person in the room was the safest one to underestimate. In 3+ decades at IRSCI, I had worked 211 cases. I had testified in federal court 47 times. I had helped put away a city councilman, 2 mortgage brokers, a regional bank VP, and a woman who ran a tax preparation chain as a front for refund fraud affecting over 3,000 taxpayers. My supervisor used to say that I could smell structured transactions through a balance sheet the way other people smell rain before the clouds show up. My son-in-law had structured $260,000 in wire transfers through an LLC registered in Ohio. He had made a mistake that I had seen exactly once before in my career. He had confused my silence for ignorance. He had looked at a retired man in a modest house driving a paid-off truck and seen someone harmless. He had performed his contempt so comfortably, so publicly, that he'd done it at a dinner table in front of witnesses. That is always the mistake, not the fraud itself. Fraud is almost always discovered eventually. The mistake is when they stop being careful because they've decided you don't matter. I called Dennis back Friday afternoon. "Make the FinCEN call," I said. "Already did," he said. "Also, Edmund, there's more." He'd found a second entity, not one of Troy's LLCs. This one was in my daughter's name. A sole proprietorship registered with the Ohio Secretary of State 6 months ago. June Decker, doing business as JD Property Consulting. It had a business checking account. 7 deposits had been made into that account in the past 5 months. The deposits were also structured. Never over $9,500. Total $58,000. I put the phone down on the table for a moment, not to compose myself. I've handled worse news than this in my career, delivered worse news than this, sat across from people receiving worse news than this. I put the phone down because I needed a second to shift registers. From father to investigator, and that shift doesn't happen instantly the way it used to when I was 40. I picked the phone back up. "Does she show any activity on that account?" I asked. "One withdrawal. $4,1200 to a boutique in the short north, 4 months ago." My daughter knew about the account. She'd spent money from it. It may not have been her idea, but she knew. That night I drove past their house. I didn't stop. The Yukon was in the driveway. The lights in the living room were on. I could see the blue flicker of the television through the front window. Normal Friday night. No idea. I went home and I made a list. It took me most of the night, which is how long it takes to do it right. Not a list of what I knew, but a list of what was provable, what was documentable, what a federal prosecutor could use versus what was inference. I have been making this distinction for 38 years. Inference is what you follow. Evidence is what you present. You do not present inference. You do not let inference make you act before you're ready. By 2 a.m, the list was clear. What I had was enough to open a case. What I didn't have yet was the document I needed most. The one that would tell me exactly how deep my daughter was in it voluntarily versus how deep she'd been pulled by a man she trusted. There was only one place that document would be. I had given June a spare key to my house years ago. She had given me one to hers when they moved in, the same day they got the locks changed on the new place. "Just in case, Dad," she'd said. I had kept it on my keyring ever since. I had never used it. I used it on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, at 6:45 a.m. I knew they were gone. June had mentioned a weekend trip to visit her college roommate in Cleveland, and I'd confirmed it by driving past the house the night before and finding the driveway empty and the mail piling up in the box. The house smelled like their candles. The kitchen was clean. The living room had that stage quality, like a room assembled to be photographed rather than lived in. I didn't linger. Troy's home office was off the hallway past the staircase. The door was locked. A privacy lock, interior knob, the kind you can open with a straightened paperclip in 20 seconds. I had a pick tool in my jacket pocket that I'd carried for 20 years. The lock opened in 11 seconds. The office was the only honest room in the house. Papers everywhere. An overflowing inbox tray. 3 coffee cups at varying levels. A stack of unopened mail. Several envelopes stamp final notice in red. The desk had 2 drawers. The top one wasn't locked. The bottom one was. The bottom lock was better. A keyed drawer lock, probably a Medico knockoff. It took me closer to 4 minutes. My hands aren't what they were, but they still work. Inside the drawer, a zippered leather portfolio, olive green, nice quality. Monogrammed tad in gold on the lower right corner. I unzipped it. The first document was a promissory note. Lender, Meridian Capital Group LLC. An address in Las Vegas, Nevada. Borrower, Troy Allen Decker. Amount, $340,000. Interest rate, 8% per month. The note was dated 14 months ago. 8% per month. Not per year. Per month, that is not a lender. That is a mechanism for permanent indebtedness. No one who takes a loan at 8% monthly ever intends for it to be repaid through normal means. That's a loan you take when someone has something on you, or when you have no other options, or when you plan to be somewhere else when the bill comes due. The second document was a promissory note from the same lender. A second draw, $80,000, 4 months later. Same rate. Behind those, bank statements for Decker Capital Partners, LLC. I found the wire transfers Dennis had described. I photographed every page. Then I found something Dennis hadn't mentioned because it hadn't been accessible through public records. A typed memo, 2 pages, on the letterhead of Meridian Capital Group, LLC. It outlined a consulting arrangement. Troy was to receive a commission for referring new investors to certain opportunities. The commission structure was described in vague enough language to be deniable. The amounts were not vague. He'd been paid $140,000 in referral fees over 14 months. He wasn't just a borrower, he was a recruiter, and at the bottom of the portfolio, behind a divider tab labeled simply Other, I found what I'd come looking for. A printout. A loan application. The lender was a company called Summit Lending Partners, a name I didn't recognize, with an address in Indianapolis. The applicant was Troy Allen Decker. The cosigner line was filled in with my name, Edmund J. Voss, and a Columbus address. My Social Security number, my pension income listed correctly. The signature on the cosigner line was mine. My signature with the small looping E and the sharp downstroke of the B that I've had since I was in my 20s. I had not signed this document. I stood in that office for a moment and I thought back over the past year. There had been a Sunday afternoon, football, mid-October, when Troy had stopped by unexpectedly. He'd brought a 6-pack, very casual, very drop-in. He needed a quick signature, he said, something for June's student loan consolidation. The bank was being bureaucratic about paperwork. He'd set a single page in front of me, the signature line exposed, the top of the document folded back. I had signed it. I'd been watching the game. The Buckeyes were down by 4 in the third quarter. I had not read the top of the document. 38 years of reading financial documents, and I signed something without reading it, because my son-in-law timed it precisely to a 4th down play. I photographed everything. Every page. I put the portfolio back exactly as I'd found it, relocked the drawer, relocked the office door, and left the house the same way I'd come in. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I am not a man who yells. I am not a man who punches walls or throws things. I have interviewed people who'd stolen millions of dollars from their neighbors, and I've done it in a level voice with a yellow legal pad on the table in front of me. But sitting in my kitchen that Saturday morning, I allowed myself exactly 90 seconds of something that was not level. Then I finished my coffee and I picked up the phone. I called Dennis first. I told him what I'd found. I told him about the forged signature. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Edmund, you know what this means for the timeline." I knew what it meant. Summit Lending Partners wasn't a bank. It was another private lender, probably in the same network as Meridian. Troy had gotten a fraudulent loan in my name, my credit, my pension, my signature on documents I'd never seen, and used it to pay down a portion of what he owed to the Meridian people. Enough to keep them calm, enough to buy time. and the structured payments through Decker Capital Partners LLC were likely money he was moving for the Meridian principals, cleaning it as it passed through, taking a cut. He owed them money and served them simultaneously, which meant he was trapped. The Yukon, the house, the $58,000 in June's consulting account, none of it was wealth. It was all someone else's money, staged to look like success while the actual debt compounded at 8% monthly in a Las Vegas filing cabinet. He'd tried to add my apartment to the stack. The call I made next was to a former colleague at the Columbus field office of IRS Criminal Investigation. I am not going to name him here. He is still active. I told him I had a referral. A formal one, from a retired special agent with 3 decades of relevant experience, and I had documentary evidence of structuring, wire fraud, and a forged signature on a loan application. He asked me to email him a summary and said he'd have it in front of the right people by Monday. Then I waited. That is the hardest part of this kind of work. Once the refer is made, the process belongs to other people and you have to sit with what you know. I spent most of Sunday at my kitchen table. I thought about June. Not as someone complicit, not yet. As someone who had been choosing not to ask questions because the answers would have required her to act. That is its own kind of choice. I know that. I've sat across from enough people who made that choice to know it doesn't always come from malice. It comes from fear, from attachment, from the unbearable cost of admitting that the life you've built is constructed on something rotten. But not asking questions is still a choice, and that choice has a legal name. I called her Sunday night. She picked up on the first ring. Her voice was careful in a way that told me she'd been waiting for this call. "Hi, Dad." "June," I said. "I need to talk to you about JD Property Consulting." The silence that followed was 7 seconds long. I counted. "How do you know about that?" she said finally. "It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that I do. I know about the deposits. I know about the structure of the transfers. I know about the Meridian note, both draws. And I know about the Summit application with my name on it." She made a sound I hadn't heard from her since she was maybe 9 years old, when she'd broken a window with a baseball and tried to hide it. That particular sound, not crying exactly, more like the noise a person makes when the thing they've been holding together very carefully finally comes apart all at once. "Dad, I didn't know where the money came from." He told me it was consulting fees. He set up the account and I didn't ask. "You spent $4,200 out of it at a boutique in the short north." Silence. "You're a trained accountant, June. You worked in audit. You know what structured deposits look like." "I know." Her voice was almost nothing. I knew it wasn't right. I didn't want to know more than that. There it was. Not innocence. Not ignorance. The deliberate maintenance of a distance that felt like deniability. I'd heard this from people in boardrooms. I had heard it from spouses of fraudsters who deposited checks into joint accounts and decided the best policy was not to read the memos. It is not a legal defense. It is sometimes treated as a mitigating factor, depending on the prosecutor and the circumstances, but it is not a defense. "He's going to run," I said. "When he realizes the investigation has started, which will be soon, he is going to leave, and when he does, everything attached to his name and your name will be frozen or seized. The consulting account, the house, anything with your signature on it as an officer or beneficial owner of any of his entities. He wouldn't leave me." I didn't say anything. "Dad, he wouldn't. His loan is at 8% per month, June. He owes over $400,000 to people who are not going to wait for a repayment plan. He recruited investors and took a $140,000 commission. He forged my signature on a loan application. He is not a man who is managing his situation. He is a man who has run out of runway and is deciding which direction to run. I've seen this before, more times than you want to know. Another long silence. Then what do I do? You call a criminal defense attorney first thing tomorrow morning. You tell them everything. Everything, June. Not just what you think is relevant, all of it. And then you call the U.S. Attorney's Office and you ask to speak with someone about cooperation. Cooperation. I mean you get in front of this before it gets in front of you. You are not the target here. You could be a witness. You could be a cooperating party, but only if you move fast and you're completely honest. If you wait, if you try to protect him, if you let a lawyer tell you to sit tight and say nothing, you will be standing next to him when the charges are filed, not across the room from him. She was crying now, not loudly. Just the specific sound of someone who has understood something they cannot ununderstand. Dad, I'm so sorry. About Thanksgiving. About everything. I'm sorry. I had been waiting for this, I think, without knowing I was waiting for it, and I found that it didn't fix anything. I don't mean that coldly. I mean that an apology, even a genuine one, doesn't reverse the action that required it. She had stood in that living room and smiled. She had spent money she knew wasn't clean. She had let me sign something she knew Troy had brought for a reason. The apology was real. The things it was apologizing for were also real. Get the attorney, I said. Do it first thing tomorrow. I hung up. I didn't watch for updates. I don't have the temperament for watching. I went about my week. I paid my utilities online. I had the furnace serviced. It's been making a noise on startup that I've been ignoring for 2 months. I called my old supervisor, who is 71 now and lives in Sarasota, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. I did not mention Troy Decker. On a Wednesday, 11 days later, Dennis sent me a text message. It said, "Your boy made a move. Tried to wire $60,000 out of the Decker Capital account to a bank in Cyprus. Wire was flagged and frozen. He's been picked up for questioning. Civil asset forfeiture initiated on 3 accounts." I set my phone face down on the table. That Thursday, a federal investigator called me to confirm some details from the referral documentation. The call lasted 20 minutes. I answered every question with the specificity that 38 years of practice had given me, and when I was done the investigator said, "Mr. Voss, can I ask, what did you do before you retired?" I told him. There was a pause. Then he said, "I wondered." Troy had not made it out of the country. He'd made it to Columbus Airport, where a federal hold on his passport flagged him at the counter. He had, according to Dennis, expressed genuine shock that this was possible. He had apparently believed, right up to the moment the TSA supervisor asked him to step out of the boarding line, that he'd covered his tracks well enough. He hadn't covered anything. He'd just never been looked at closely by someone who knew what to look for. The house was placed under a federal lien. June had retained an attorney and made the call I told her to make. I don't know the specifics of her cooperation agreement, and I'm not going to ask. That is between her and the people she's speaking to, and my knowing the details doesn't help anyone. She came to my door on a Friday evening, about 3 weeks after everything started moving. She looked like she hadn't slept properly since Thanksgiving. She had no coat on, which struck me because it was 31 degrees. I opened the door wide enough to stand in the frame. "Dad," she said. Her voice had nothing performative in it, no softness calculated to reach me. She just looked at me the way you look at someone when you've run out of ways to make yourself look better than you are. Attorney, she started. I know, I said. Dennis keeps me generally informed. She nodded. She looked at the floor, then back up at me. I knew something was wrong, she said. I think I knew for a long time. I just didn't want to lose the life. She said it plainly, no self-pity, and I respected that. That was my choice. I know that. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was still June. She was also someone who'd spent 4 years making the choice not to know what she knew, and that second person was going to be with her for a long time. You're going to have a hard few years, I said. I know. The attorney will get you through the legal piece if you stay honest. The rest of it, the job, the finances, starting over, that's just work. You're capable of work. She waited, I think, for me to say something else. An invitation inside. Forgiveness delivered at the doorstep. I didn't have that in me, not yet, and I wasn't going to pretend I did. Barbara would probably have let her in right then. Barbara was a more immediately generous person than I am. But Barbara also would have known, without me saying it, that letting someone in before the accounting is done doesn't help them. It just delays it. Call me when you got your own place, I said. And a job. She nodded once. She walked back to her car. I watched her go, then closed the door. I went back to my study. I sat at my desk. The badge was still where I'd left it, on the corner of the desk under the lamp. I picked it up and looked at it for a moment, the way I used to look at it at the end of a long case, not with pride exactly, more like acknowledgement. This was done. The next thing would come. I put it back in the drawer, turned the key, and went to make dinner. I've been thinking about what Troy got wrong. Not the fraud. The fraud was almost inevitable, given who he was. What he got wrong was something simpler and more fundamental. He looked at a quiet man in a modest house and decided that quietness meant weakness. He saw no performance of power, no expensive watch, no loud opinions at the dinner table, and he read all of that as absence, as nothing. As someone you could dismiss with a laugh in front of 15 people and never think about again. That is a particular kind of blindness, and in my experience, it is almost always self-inflicted. Troy had spent years building the appearance of a life, the subdivision house, the leased Yukon, the blazer that cost more than my monthly utilities, and somewhere in the process of constructing all that appearance, he started to believe that appearance was the only thing that mattered. If you looked successful, you were powerful. If you looked ordinary, you were nothing. He applied that logic to everyone around him, including me, and it cost him everything. What I keep coming back to is the difference between the life Troy was performing and the one I was actually living. I don't say that with pride. I say it because the distinction is useful. I had spent 38 years doing work that required me to be honest, methodical, and patient. Honest about what the numbers actually said, not what someone wanted them to say. Methodical enough to build a case that would hold up in federal court. Not just satisfy my own suspicions, patient enough to wait for the right moment instead of acting on anger. Those 3 things, honesty, clear thinking, and the discipline to keep going when the work is slow, aren't glamorous. They don't photograph well. They don't impress people at parties, but they compound over time in ways that matter. Troy's approach also compounded. Debt at 8% monthly compounds very quickly in the wrong direction. I think about June too, and I try to be fair about it. She is not a stupid person. She is not a bad person, fundamentally. She is someone who made the decision repeatedly over 4 years to not look at something she didn't want to see. That is a choice that feels like passivity but isn't. It requires active effort to maintain a deliberate blind spot, especially when you have the training to know exactly what you're not looking at. The cost of that choice was 4 years of her life, a federal investigation, and a cooperation agreement that is going to follow her for a long time. I don't tell this story because I came out of it well. I tell it because the lesson is the same one I tried to teach every young agent who came through my unit. The truth of a situation doesn't care whether you're looking at it. The number is wrong whether you read that column or not. You can choose not to know, but choosing not to know is still a choice, and it carries exactly the same weight as knowing. The people who do the most damage in the world are rarely the smartest ones in the room. They're usually the ones who've convinced themselves that charm is a substitute for character, and that the quiet man in the corner isn't watching. I put the badge back in the drawer. I made dinner. I went to bed at 10:30. Some things end without ceremony, and that's exactly right.